Hello and welcome back. The topic of this video now, we're going to cover some of the hypersensitivities that occur with an inappropriate immune response. All right, so with hypersensitivities, you've got a response that either is excessive in what happens, it's triggered at a wrong time, or that hypersensitivity ends up causing damage, either at the cell or tissue level. Okay? We've got 4 types that we're going to cover. I'm going to kind of list each of the 4 types here, and then I'm going to focus on the first one in the remainder of this video. So type 1 hypersensitivity is going to be mediated by the antibody IgE, okay? And that type 1 hypersensitivity is your classic allergy response. And I'm going to go into a bit more detail here in a bit on this one, okay? Type 2 hypersensitivity involves different antibodies. It's either mediated by IgG or IgM, okay? And in this case, we're talking about damage to cells that happens, okay? Red blood cell lysis with an incorrect blood transfusion would be an example of a type 2 hypersensitivity. All right. Type 3 hypersensitivity now is going to be IgG mediated. And now we're talking about targeting tissues. All right. And what ends up happening with the type 3 you end up having an immune complex that's formed. That immune complex ends up being deposited into the tissue, and because of that, that causes the damage to the tissue. All right? I'm going to change my pen color here for type 4, okay? Because with type 1, 2, and 3, these are all mediated by antibodies. So antibodies, if you remember, are going to be produced by the B cells. So this is essentially a B cell response. The type 4 hypersensitivity now involves an inappropriate or an excessive T cell response. Okay? And these are going to be also referred to as delayed type hypersensitivities. If you've ever had a TB test done, that TB test, they're intentionally injecting a little bit of the antigen underneath your skin to see if you've been exposed to tuberculosis, okay? So in this case, it's going to be your T cells that are going to respond, and I'll go into more detail on that, okay? But that is an important distinction between type 4 from types 1 through 3, okay? So with this, we'll kind of start discussing the type 1 hypersensitivity, all right? So what you've got with your type 1 hypersensitivity, right? You've got your B cell that is triggered when you first encounter the antigen. And that B cell releases that IgE antibody, okay? What happens on your and I'll put this up here, your first response, or your first, well, I shouldn't say response, I should say exposure, right? That's a better word. Your first exposure to the antigen, you're going to get those IgE antibodies released. And I'm just going to make them little y's here, right? What those IgE antibodies are going to do is they go and they find a mast cell. And they sit themselves on the outside of that mast cell. And that mast cell will circulate, okay? One of the key things associated with a mast cell, and I'm going to draw them just as a lot of little dots here. It's filled with histamine, okay? On your second exposure, right? You've got your antigen here. Now it binds to that IgE antibody. And what that does, the binding of the antigen is it triggers that release of histamine, okay? So we've got our antigen up here, all right? Now, the key here is our antigen is something that's actually non-threatening to the body. All right? Pollen, great example, okay? And that type 1 hypersensitivity, this is your allergy response, okay? So when that pollen is released, initially, that kind of primes your immune system. Your immune system releases those IgE antibodies, attaches those IgE antibodies to the mast cell. Now that mast cell is ready the next time it encounters pollen, it releases all of those histamines, okay? So with that type 1 hypersensitivity, all right, you're encountering something non-threatening. And I use pollen as an example. There are also various foods like peanuts, which tend to be a very common allergy, that can result in this response as well. Okay? So what ends up happening, oh, I can spell, I really can. You guys believe me, right? That release of histamine is going to trigger some inflammation, okay? It's going to bring in immune cells because it thinks it's encountered a bacteria or a virus or something it needs help with being destroyed, okay? But what those histamines also do, all right, they work to increase vascular permeability. I can spell. Okay, which means that release of histamines kind of opens up the endothelial cells so that those immune systems can get out and get to whatever the trigger was. In this case, either the pollen or the peanuts, right? And that increased permeability is a vasodilation. Okay, it goes along with vasodilation. So you're also increasing or expanding the blood vessels because you want to bring blood to the area. Okay? The histamines are also what are responsible for the itchiness that are associated with allergies. You also get smooth muscle contraction. In the respiratory system, okay? And that contraction in the respiratory system can lead to breathing difficulties. So some people who have allergies to peanuts, right, they can't breathe, they feel like they can't breathe. They can't breathe because their, the smooth muscle around their bronchioles are contracting and they're not getting air deep into the lung, okay? You also get an increase in the release of mucus. So with that, tends to go along more with the pollen, right? You go outside, you're kind of got some kind of congestion going on, but you don't really feel sick per se. That's part of your immune system essentially overreacting, okay? So with our type 1 hypersensitivity, let me switch colors here. We can have mild symptoms like the itchiness, okay, hives, congestion, or you can go more severe with things like the smooth muscle, right? And that can lead to constriction, can also lead to, let me just put that in, constriction of the airway. It can also lead to edema from the vascular permeability. You're bringing fluids into an area, and if you've got fluids in an area where you don't want them, that swelling can interfere with body processes, okay? And then our most severe is if we go to anaphylaxis, okay? Anaphylaxis is going to be where individuals who have severe allergies typically are going to carry an EpiPen with them. That EpiPen contains epinephrine. That epinephrine counteracts the muscle contraction and the permeability to take things the other way. So when the person takes the EpiPen, that gets them breathing easier, all right? But that's not the treatment, right? The EpiPen is there to give the person enough time to get to the emergency room where that inappropriate immune response can be counteracted, okay, on a more complete level, all right? So anaphylaxis would be the most severe. With management of type 1, I typically don't talk about treatments, but this is one where I do kind of bring things in because of histamine, right? Typically, if you have allergies, antihistamines are something that you may take. That counteracts the histamine release, okay? Also associated with treatment, I should put it in proper. Corticosteroids can be given because those corticosteroids work to dampen the immune response. And in the case of type 1 hypersensitivities or severe allergies, there are some IgE blockers treatments that can be done. So essentially it's working to desensitize the individual to whatever is triggering the allergy, whether it be peanuts or whether it be pollen, okay? Now typically your pollen isn't gonna have as severe a reaction as say a food allergy. Food allergies tend to be more likely to go anaphylactic, But there are other things as well. Individuals can be allergic to bee stings, and that can trigger anaphylaxis as well. In the case of the anaphylaxis, I should probably write this in. I don't know if you can see it. This is where the epinephrine would be involved, all right? Thank you for your attention. Please let me know if you have any